This autumn, we're going to have a 4 series of programs, starting today, of course, with Christians in the political process. And then we would go on to develop further what we had started last winter in an examination of Islam. And we're fortunate to have a first-rate professor from Columbia, Peter Owen, come for those 3 Sundays, they will be, to discuss the development of Islam and Islam in the present global condition. After that, we're going to look at the impact of the newer sciences on religious views and vice versa. The genetic revolution has caused people to rethink a lot of things. And some very interesting books by scientists on science and faith have been published just within the last year or so. And I think that will be an interesting series. And fourth and finally, during Advent, we're going to consider the situation in Korea and in India. So that's the menu for this fall. And we will be delighted to have you participate in all of it. Today we start a series on Christians and the political process. I think it's fair to say that there's been a certain amount of heat developed on this subject through recent years, and that there has been a good deal of argument over the role of Christians in the political process in the United States at the end of the 20th century. I'm hoping that in this series, for which we have, I think, an excellent panel of discussion leaders, we will be able to emphasize more of the light and less of the heat. But what we want to do, really, is to get a sense of how a person with Christian faith can deal with the political process as it has developed at this end of our century. For this course, we have several readings. The key reading is the issue of the Living Pulpit, whose editor-in-chief sits in our front row this morning. The issue dealing with politics. The Living Pulpit publisher has given us about 40 copies of that. And I must explain that when they came in last week, they were offered to pre-registrants at $3 each. We discovered that the church is paying $6. Pay what you will and want to, but I think you will be glad to have a copy of that. In addition, there are some other readings up here that you can look at. If you're interested in any of them, let Gordon or me know, and we will get copies for next week. They're from the organization in Chicago, based in Chicago, called Protestants for the Common Good, and for one in California, Call for Renewal, and the Claremont Consultation, and others. So these are the sorts of materials that are available. If you know of others that you'd like us to pay attention to, again, let Gordon or me know. I'm always joyed when the time comes to start a program, and we have as the starter Don Shriver. We know him well in this church. He has been here in discussing and ending or ending last winter spring. President Emeritus of Union Theological Seminary. He is one of the leading American ethicists, and he is going to launch us this morning, Don, if you would, on this series. Welcome to all of you once again.
Well, Don? It is a pleasure to be here again to people, many of whose faces in this audience I recognize. Some of you have a hunger to improve your baptism, as an ancient Calvinist phrase would have it, and that's education. I have been asked to give a kind of a general introduction to a Christian view of politics, and I'm going to seek to be rather general because the others following in this series will be somewhat more specific. To start with, I'd say that it makes a difference whether you identify yourself as an American who happens to be a Christian or a Christian who happens to be an American. It's a question of which comes first, which is the deepest, most fundamental measure of your selfhood and the society you see yourself identified with. Conscientious Christians do not want to avoid a connection between their faith and their citizenship, but they will probably have to struggle at times to know what it means to put faith first rather than national loyalty first. Not for Christians, the famous toast by Stephen Decatur in the early part of the 19th century. My country, may she always be right, but right or wrong, my country. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was clear about the religious inadmissibility of that attitude when at Union Seminary in the summer of 1939 he decided to return to Germany to work for the defeat of his country in the coming war in Europe. Said he, I must return so that I may help Christian civilization to survive. I have some problems with the concept of Christian civilization, but in Bonhoeffer's case, it was admissible. What is Christian politics? Members of the so-called Christian coalition seem to know, and from time to time, many churches, including Presbyterians, recommend to governments and political leaders some view on a political issue which is said to be a Christian view. I like the use of a rather than the in that phrase. People who are cynical about religion's role in politics, not speak of those who are skeptical about all ethical claims in political conflict, can box us into silence here, especially as they remind us of what colossal horrors have sometimes marched into history under the banner of religion. One thinks to the justifications of slavery by theologians in the Southern Presbyterian Church, in which I was raised, in the Civil War era. I wasn't raised in that era, but they did theologize on that subject in the Civil War era. One thinks about the super-religious enthusiasm for war against Germany that swept this country in 1917, and even the grim righteousness that infused Operation Just Cause, the Gulf War of early 1991. What would it be to take a Christian view of politics in America? I have some suggestions that are not centered on any one political issue, past or present, though I have a few illustrations along the way. If there is a Christian view of politics, that view stems not from some form of religiously coded political correctness, but from standards of understanding, judgment, and perception derived from a certain framework or context of Christian life in the midst of the political order. As some of you know, one of my teachers, Paul Lehman, who was for many years associated in his retirement with this church, began one of his books on Christian ethics talking about the Greek word from which the word ethics is derived. Indeed, we have the word in our language, ethos. One of the original meanings of the Greek word ethos was the fence or the stall that you put around animals in order to protect them from whatever. A fence is both a limitation and a protection. No one lives without some kind of a fence or orientation or some sense that when you get up in the morning, what it is good, proper, right, and wrong to do on that day. Now, as a start of a definition of that fence or context, here are some very simple, fundamental theological propositions. First, Government is not God. That's the rule of the Hebrew Bible that protects Jews and Christians from totalitarianism. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Gott ist mein Führer, nicht Adolf Hitler. Obedience to that fundamental rule cost Dietrich Bonhoeffer his life. Secondly, as humans, we are all agents of both good and evil. Our biblical view of human beings is a kind of a mixture of good and evil. Not too much optimism, not too much pessimism. We can be agents, but we can be agents of either good or evil. The Ten Commandments are unusual in that when it says, thou shalt do this and that, it is an address to the individual thou. It is addressed not only to humans in the mass, but to the individual believer. The positive duties among those 10 are only 2 or 3. Worship God, remember the Sabbath, honor your parents. The other commands are negative warnings about what sins we humans are capable of. Idolatry, blasphemous language, murder, adultery, theft, lying, coveting. It's quite a formidable mixture of warnings, reminding us all that there's a lot of capacity for evil doing not only out there, but also in here. Somehow we are suspended between optimism and pessimism about ourselves. We have capacities for doing good and doing evil. So, adding to the first rule that government is not God, we have to confess that we citizens are not divine either. And from this is a corollary that every one of us needs some encouragement for doing good and some discouragement from doing evil. The case for law, government, and some forms of coercion are here, a notion that John Calvin knew only too well. Government, law enforcement, division of governmental powers, rights of citizen petition, all have something to do with this. There are no perfect political orders, laws, procedures, authorities, majorities, political parties, or individuals. All of us at all levels have to reckon with our personal and collective capacities for good and evil. But that is a kind of a regulated principle. I do not know a better summary or start as a guide for social behavior of both Jews and Christians than that famous verse in Micah 6:8, which I say is a third preliminary rule. What does the Lord require of thee but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God? That summary alone should incline us all to be distant from certain kinds of political claims, which I'm going to get into in a minute. If you wanted to test yourself as to whether or not you have some inclinations to do theology and ethics in relation to national ideology, I suggest as a kind of a heuristic question. If you could vote on the matter, would you prefer as our national anthem the Star-Spangled Banner or America the Beautiful? I tell you frankly, I'm not altogether friendly toward the Star-Spangled Banner, which is 60 years old as our official national anthem. If you read the text of America the Beautiful, a marvelous poem by Catherine Lee Bates, I think you'll find a certain compatibility with that text, with Christian theology and ethics, not straight down the line, but a lot more than rockets' red glare and a tattered flag flying over Fort McHenry in the midst of a war might suggest. We could debate that. But all I'm saying is that thinking Christians might find that the notion of God mending every flaw of this nation and crowning our good with brotherhood, or as the new hymnal puts it, servanthood. These are terms that have a certain relationship of positive kind to some biblical orientations. Think about it. Well, before I get into some of the issues, let me just run down what I would want to be sure that you and I know about what might be called the resources for thinking about Christian faith and politics. First and supremely, the Bible. All 66 books of it, especially remembering to include those parts originally written in Hebrew. I'm supposed to be a professional Christian ethicist, as Phil has suggested, though I must admit that Aristotle was right a long time ago when he said it's hard to be counted an expert in ethics because everybody thinks they know something about ethics, and the reason for that is everybody does know something about ethics. It's inherently discussable. But what I've been asked to do is to talk about in what terms Christians discuss ethics in politics. And I think we must not forget that Jesus thought of what we call the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, as basic to his own teachings. And a second resource, therefore, are the teachings of Jesus. Perhaps the simplest, most authoritative rule for Christian ethics is the two words of Jesus: follow me. It's a pretty threatening rule. The New Testament is not altogether positive about government and political power and political conflict, for the simple, devastating reason that a government, perhaps the best government that the world at that point had known, the Romans, that government crucified Jesus of Nazareth, and did it with the collaboration of the leaders of what could well be said to be the finest religion in the world, namely Judaism. Without that combination, it's unlikely that Jesus would have been crucified. Why was he crucified? Well, scholars debate that. The simplest explanation or justification seems to be that line: he is a friend of sinners. He broke up the prestige system of that time in such a way as to challenge all establishments, Roman and Jewish combined. And he did this with a train of teachings which were an attempt to equip a small, anonymous band of disciples to carry on the spirit and the substance of those teachings into the world. He called them, "You are the salt of the earth, the light of the world," which suggests a certain distance from violence and also a certain distance from making a lot of noise. You are like salt and light to change things noiselessly. A third resource we have to mention, and that is the you in the salt and light teaching of the Sermon on the Mount is plural. It refers to the new community of disciples, the church. Don't forget that the church is a resource for Christian thinking about almost anything, from theology to family life to politics. We are to consult the brothers and the sisters in the faith, and that is what we are doing right now. You are yourself heeding that instruction. Jesus promised to be present to a collective. Where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them. Finally, there is the resource that moves in, through, and beyond all of these resources, the very Spirit of God. When they drag you into the courtroom, don't worry about what you will say, said Jesus. My Spirit will teach you what to say, and I am with you always, even to the end of the world. That's a very powerful resource, is it not? Not to be depended on in abstraction from those other resources that I have listed. Holy Spirit moves through Bible, through the teachings of Jesus, through the church, into the world, through the likes of us even. Now, all of that is a background of Christian social ethics. What in the fall of 1996 might that have to do with being a Christian citizen in the USA? For the sake of our consideration, I want to concede that it's hard to be a Christian anywhere on earth and not to have some tincture, some flavor, some influence played out in one's life that is the result of a particular culture that you're born into, maybe. You and I might try to shed the clothing of our American upbringing, but we probably can never do so any more than a Christian in China or Germany is likely to do so. In fact, the oldest, most difficult question in Christian social ethics is how you can move from the Christian norms through the social into the ethics without losing the Christian, or becoming so captive to the particular society you're in that there is nothing distinctly Christian about one's ethical practice in that society. Among other things, this means calling a stop to certain kinds of alleged connections between popular thinking and the Christian faith. If I gave you a test and said, now, tell me the biblical location of the following quotation, God helps those who help themselves. Well, I'm not going to do that test this morning. If it was anything that was less biblical than that slogan, I don't know. But at any rate, let's move on. All I'm saying is that living in America, like living anywhere, exacts a tax on our religion. What it might mean for the religion to exact a tax on Americanism is what I'm after here this morning. To do so is to approach the age-old question that H. Richard Niebuhr posed in his book of 45 years ago, Christ and Culture. Let's look a minute at what might be a précis of the political culture of the USA. It was stated classically for us in the Declaration of Independence, and it got filled out a bit from the well-known Pledge of Allegiance. Let me look on the board for that one. You will remember Declaration of Independence talks about life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and we mouth that very, very often. And our politicians mouth, our own mouths, and all the rest. Well, the Pledge of Allegiance, as you may remember, speaks about one nation under God. We're now talking about what it means to talk about anything under God. One nation under God with liberty, repeating liberty, underlining it, so to speak, and justice for all. Now, those are great words about most political speeches in this country. I looked at more of the two political conventions this summer than was a wise use of my time. And I did not take careful notes, but if there are recordings of those conventions, I would have posed this hypothesis, that the word liberty or freedom appeared 10 times more in the speeches than the word justice. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. All I'm saying is that be those who don't get around to the justice and want to talk about that now for a minute. I want to propose that for every one of these concepts, there are 4 of them up there is a Christian slant that we in the churches ought to be seriously considering as we go about our voting and our forming of political opinions. You can pull the meaning of these well-worn concepts in different, even opposite directions. For example, life. Is that life for me? Yes. For whom else is it life? For all human beings? Well, with a deep breath, we have to say yes. For other forms of life, does this right to life translate into the life for other creatures on this planet, or for the life of the planet itself? Furthermore, are the right to life opponents of abortion on sound ground when they combine this phrase in the Declaration of Independence with the 5th commandment against murder? This debate on abortion is fueled by Bible and American thinking but it is fueled on the opposite side by the second part of this Declaration of Independence, and that is liberty. The word most frequently on the lips of American politicians. What shall we say about the abortion question? Shall we come down on the right to life or the right to free choice? In other words, freedom of what sort? And it is at this point that I think we Christians ought to be doing a great deal more thinking about two versions of liberty. One is liberty or freedom from something. And the other side is a freedom for something. You can fill in the somethings. But a great deal depends on which side of those you and I really come down. Listen to much talk in public and much behavior in private, and you're likely to concede that most Americans cherish the liberty to be from something rather than for something. It's not a simple choice. One version of freedom for is the freedom to associate in a church, a club, a political party. But coupled with this freedom is the freedom to dissociate, to quit these connections for some good or bad reason. What would seem to be a shut door to Christian alternatives is the notion of being free to be only me in my lonesomeness. There are philosophies which say that is the fundamental freedom. I cannot find that in the Hebrew Bible or in the teachings of Jesus. Obligations to neighbors over ignoring neighbors. Responsibility to neighbors over freedom from them. You may move to the suburbs or never venture north of 96th Street as a matter of American constitutional right. But there is another constitution, a Christian biblical one, that mandates you shall love your neighbor as a person like yourself. And there is little in the meaning of this command to suggest that your neighborhood stops at 96th Street or with either the Atlantic or the Pacific Oceans. And that suggests a possible Christian suspicion of that other famous phrase from the Declaration of Independence. I put it in brackets for a theological reason. The pursuit of happiness. How does that phrase ring in your ears over against, say, the word of Jesus, seek ye first the kingdom of God and God's righteousness, and all these things will be added to you? Or that other word, whoever seeks to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses her life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. Or that most threatening word of all, take up your cross and follow me. Doesn't much resonate with the pursuit of happiness, does it? Here we are on famed Madison Avenue, headquarters of the world's advertising industry. It is not necessarily a bad industry, but its major tool of trade is the pursuit of happiness through all these things against which Jesus warned us for putting first. Peruse the ads in any Sunday magazine of the New York Times, and you might find yourself smiling at most of those ads and quietly raising a prayer. Lord, protect me against idolatry of glamour, or the quest for eternal beauty, or the pursuit of happiness through the accumulation of possessions. Advertisers want us to pursue happiness. Jesus bids us pursue something political called the kingdom of God. Now, for probing what that might mean in relation to the American creed, turn finally to those phrases in the Pledge of Allegiance. One nation under God with liberty and justice for all. For the sake of brevity, let's note that the under in under God comports very exactly with the original Hebrew command against treating government or politics or the nation itself as divine. And what it might mean to be one nation, I will leave open for connection with what it means to add that last phrase in the Pledge of Allegiance, for all. Note that the Pledge of Allegiance repeats the classic accents on liberty, but adds that companion phrase, and with justice. Freedom and justice are words old in the language of Jews and Christians. But I suspect that we Christians have more to learn from Jews about justice than Jews in return have to learn from contemporary Christians about liberty. For again, justice in the American context can be pulled in two directions. Is it justice for me and mine? Or is it justice for you and yours? It makes a lot of difference which one you start with. Is it justice for folk who have the power to get justice, or those who lack such power too? Above many an American courthouse stands the inscription, which I think is also above the Supreme Court building, equal justice under law. To put the question in abstract terms, does justice have more to do with our exercise of liberty or our acknowledgement of equality? It's a long-lasting perennial question for any democracy. My teacher, Liston Pope at Yale, used to say that the bird which we Americans ought to adopt as our mascot for our democracy is not the eagle, but the duck. Reason is, like a duck, democracy wobbles between accent on liberty in one moment and accent on equality the next. Pope would go on and say, you can examine the history of the decisions of the Supreme Court. The most vivid example would be Dred Scott versus Brown versus education, 100 years almost separating approval of slavery and denial of school segregation. But the court, or for that matter, the wobble between Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which said school desegregation is just fine. You know, states ought to be at liberty to have it, versus the 54 decision, which said, no, we're going to deny that liberty in the name of justice. Well, perhaps it is a necessary and sometimes benevolent wobble, but to forget either one of them is to forget democracy. Now, the natural sinful human tendency is to seek justice for me and mine. The ethical rule ought to be justice for all, just as the pledge ends by saying. But there is something about the Hebrew and Christian slant here that is deeply rooted in political realism when it calls for special attention to justice for the weak, the neglected, the marginal, the least powerful folk in the society. Distinctive mark of the law codes of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, and it is certainly a distinctive mark of that one who may have gone to his cross because he insisted on being a friend of sinners, that is, the rejects of society. We are to recollect that this is not only a teaching in these authoritative sources, but this is a very practical teaching, because Walter Rauschenbusch had the facts of the matter very clearly when he said, powerful people have power enough to seek their just interest and power left over to seek their unjust interest as well. Well, that impresses me as political realism. Also impresses me, therefore, is the stance that Jews and Christians ought to be always on the lookout concerning. And that is, what is happening to the weakest party in this particular event? Throughout the Bible, God is pictured as special protector and friend of the poor, the economic poor, the political poor, the cultural poor. And the plain instruction to people of Jewish and Christian faith is, go thou and do likewise. Norman Snaith, an Old Testament scholar, points out that the Hebrew word for justice is always toppling over toward mercy for the weak and helpless. Jews and Christians have little reason to distinguish sharply between love and justice, or to dismiss the obligations of government toward the poor with the easy logic, government is concerned with justice, not charity. I warn you not to put it that way, which means paying careful, unceasing attention to the last phrase in the pledge, for all. I want simply to conclude by saying that the Christian pilgrimage toward what it means to say for all is never ending. Nobody surely can effectively love everybody. And that is one good reason for government. For government does things in the name of a merciful justice and a just mercy that individually or as churches we ourselves are not likely to do. There was a smidgen of truth in what we have recently heard from some candidates for national office this summer. You know how to spend your money better than government does. That appeal, of course, is to the liberty for me side of Americanism. But political realism, not just idealism, and a staunch devotion to the Calvinist tradition will keep us remembering that government, like other institutions, provides human services and benefits to all, or is supposed to, in ways that no single person or sub-political measure can effect. I think that just plain common sense is the answer to that particular smidgen of truth about we knowing better how to spend our money. Frankly, I don't know how to spend any of my money on building a better road between here and the west side, or how to organize a police or a fire department or a national defense organization or what have you. I mean, you don't need high theology in order to laugh at some of the things politicians say. If you want some theology, by the way, go back to the book of Judges. The motto of that particular chaotic time in the life of Israel is, everyone did what was right in their own minds. Spent their money just as they wanted to spend it. And the result was social chaos. No society at all. Who was it? Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said that taxes are the price we pay for civilization. John Calvin would have loved that way of putting it. But the realistic discipline from a Christian perspective has to be a growing inclusiveness and expansion of what we really mean by for all. We live in a time when the whole world of humanity is claiming our attention as never before, and Americans have been in the forefront of building one nation from people who have immigrated from many nations of earth. It is our most notable political achievement, perhaps, to the extent that we've achieved it. We have great new task ahead as a nation if we are at least to continue a pilgrimage toward achieving it. We are always in danger of losing our nerve for trying to achieve it. I think, for example, of two issues that are now before us. One is, what rights shall we allow even our legal immigrants? Shall we deny them education, as the current Congress is now considering? Shall we cut off various benefits from them because they're not yet full-fledged citizens, even though they entered this country under the law? And I think, too, of the intergenerational justice in the matter of Social Security and Medicare funding, an issue of personal concern for me and some of you who are over 65. What are we going to do about including for all those who are younger than ourselves and those who have not yet been born into a society whose resources are going to be limited, always have been limited? What kinds of intergenerational justice are we going to be willing as an electorate to vote for? If people my age and older simply look out for the rights of the elderly to the neglect of the rights of the young, we will not really be showing our concern of justice for all. So, we live in a time when our American devotion to all is being tested, and our biblically oriented ethics are being even more tested as we push along in a pilgrimage toward a more human, inclusive society in the USA and on earth itself. To be a faithful Christian politically is always to be in some struggle to match one's place in the human journey to one's traveling instructions from the Bible, the words of Jesus, the teachings of the church, and the nudging of the Holy Spirit. It is not an easy struggle or an easy journey, but we wouldn't expect it to be that way if we really believe in one who is on the road with us with the word, follow me, I am with you to the end of the world. I think we may have a little time for discussion.
Comments or questions you have?
John, could you comment on the other side of the life question, which is capital punishment, which seems to be very much in the political situation right now with our the situation in the Bronx vis-a-vis the governor and the
We live in a time in which human capacity of and exercise of violence is so massive that if we don't take that life business more seriously than maybe sometimes we have, I'm thinking of the nuclear danger that may or may not be passed, with which massive, the whole existence of humanity may be at stake. I think we will gradually go down toward a kind of devaluation of what it is to be human. That, for me, is the great issue. You know, if you want to talk about basic issues of theology in life or no theology in life, you have to ask questions like, why are human beings valuable? Well, why should we think that whether we live or die is of no importance? Well, I think the only real answer to that one is theological. I think we value each other because we have some reason external to ourselves to think we are valued. Now, if as a society, let me put it provocatively, it is hard for me to see how the proponents of no abortion, those who affirm reverence for life, why it is that so many of them would also be in favor of capital punishment. The inconsistency there really would worry me, does worry me. I have to draw back from saying that human life is an absolute value, as though there never was a time in which one life has to be preserved at the cost of someone else. But the logic there is a means and end kind of. You may sacrifice some life because of the more ultimate reason that another life is to be preserved. Now, these are difficult questions, and I am not at the moment ready to take a stand on this, though I will say, what was it, last Thursday's New York Times had an article on the abortion question, which I recommend to you because it defined a kind of middle position which took seriously the tragedy of abortion or no abortion on either side of that debate. There are some political, social, ethical issues which do not leave us comfortable once we have taken a position on it. But that's a very, very fine question, Josie, but let me just conclude my somewhat longish answer by saying perhaps the champion inconsistency in capital punishment is that we punish the crime of murder by repeating it. You can see that movie Dead Man Walking, by the way, and get your thinking on this question really worked out. I think most critics say that movie does not take a firm position either for or against capital punishment. You can argue that. But that it shows the arguments on both sides is really quite clear. It's an important movie.
Ever since the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, several years back, I discovered that the text for the Liberty Bell was "Let liberty ring throughout the land" from Leviticus.
Yeah.
And I wonder, and I've been just kind of fantasizing ever since, because it's associated. So I looked it up. It sounds associated with the Jubilee year, redistribution of property.
Right.
And I'm wondering what.
Hey, good for you. You're practicing what I'm preaching this morning. Go back and check the text.
So I've been curious what the Founding Fathers' conception of liberty might be different from ours if they chose that text.
Yeah. Remember I said that in the Hebrew Bible, liberty and justice, freedom and justice, mercy and justice are always intermixed. And that liberty for seems to be dominant over liberty from. I can't say for sure what the Founding Fathers and Mothers meant by that. I guess I can say, though, that very few Americans are capable of the reflection out of Leviticus 25, which you just produced. I mean, if you say, plant yourself beside the Liberty Bell and say, now look, folks, let me tell you what that original text was. It was that the wealth of the land every 50 years should be redistributed. Now, if you don't get arrested, you at least will encounter a crowd, most of whom will be rather hostile. And people really dig into Leviticus 25 and the history will say, well, it was such a hard rule that it never got practiced even in ancient Israel. Okay. The phrase from Reinhold Niebuhr occurs to me, the relevance of an impossible ideal. Well, I don't know. All I know is that when it comes to justice, distributive justice is a part of it, and it certainly is part of it in the Hebrew Bible.
Going back to the original text, wasn't the original wording not pursuit of happiness and pursuit of property?
Indeed. Which you might thank God for that, waffling on the original John Locke phrase, which was life, liberty, and property. Apparently that troubled Thomas Jefferson. I don't know exactly why. I think it was an advance, because happiness seems to be a broader category than property. But make no mistake about it, the protection of property, and in fact resistance to being taxed on it, was a very big thing in the American Revolution. And we need to do a lot more thinking in the church about Christian attitudes toward property. The word property comes from a Latin word which has to do with one's own. And I've tried to think over the years how important a certain amount of property is. I mean, take the clothes on our back. They help define our individuality, among other things. And a certain amount of property is kind of necessary. We have personal control over, a place to live, for example. That all of these have. But how much property, and how much at the expense of who else, are the questions that really asked to be answered here and talked about.
One of the problems with all these programs, of course, is that you open up a zillion different ideas and there's not an opportunity to discuss them further. And I think maybe Christians like to do that because it's too challenging. But let me just make a point of comment. You were talking about the Pledge of Allegiance. When I was about 13, which was in 1960 something, I decided that I would stop saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, that was pretty difficult because I was in a Catholic high school where we said it every morning, interestingly enough, and it was something that was expected, and this was seen as a childish act of rebellion. But for me, the main reason for not saying it, even given all of the things that you've discussed, which were certainly part of it, had to do more with the fact that we're pledging allegiance to a flag. And you started out this morning by saying, are we for Americans first, or Christians first, or Christians first? And I'm just wondering, what is the implication of placing allegiance in a flag for a Christian?
Well, the Jehovah's Witnesses have made a big case of this, including the Supreme Court, and they refuse to salute anything, including the flag. I have problems with it myself, and I would not take exception to what you said. The one thing I would say is that nobody loses their cultural clothing, even when they refuse to engage in certain ceremonies. Therefore, we always have something American to deal with as we try to make some judgments out of something Christian. I'm not even sure how it is in the Madison Avenue Presbyterian Church, but I may say that, because I haven't noticed up there, but I'd like to think that you don't have an American flag up there in the sanctuary. Do you have one? Well, that showed that one of your distinguished former ministers was a good theologian. I bet it never occurred to David Reed to put it there. And the fact that he was from Scotland probably made some difference. I will say this, now this kind of shows my Scottish prejudice perhaps, but when I go into St. Paul's Cathedral in London, all those British flags and all those remnants of British colonialism really put me off, especially when I think of myself as an American who was in one of those revolts, you know. But still, there are Presbyterian churches in the land that have the American flag on one side, the so-called Christian flag on the other. I don't even know what a Christian flag is, frankly. But nonetheless, they do. And when I've mentioned this to pastors, they shake their heads sadly and they say, it would be such a big fuss in my church if I were to take that American flag out that maybe it's not worth it. Well, maybe it is. I'll leave it to their judgment. All I'm saying is, well, for that matter, American flags mostly appeared in American churches beginning with World War I, and they greatly multiplied in World War II. There are people of the land who, if they had to choose between being a Christian and being an American, would choose to be an American. Who, if they had to choose between the authority of the Bible and the authority of the U.S. Constitution, would choose the latter. You may understand this morning, I am urging you to choose the former. But it's a struggle. It's a struggle.
No call, just a gloss. National anthem. There's an odd similarity in the anthem of the land of my birth, Germany, and the land of my choice, America. The first stanza stinks. However, both of these have a beautiful last stanza, which, chastened by Hitler, the Germans now have adopted. In this country, how many of you know the last stanza of the national anthem?
Very few of us.
And so be it ever. When the wind up homes and war's desolation, blessed is victory and peace, our ever-rescued land. I'm getting weak. Praise the power that has made and preserved us a nation. For conquer we must, for our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust.
The last line is fine. The last line. The next to last line I have some questions about. We can debate that later. But let me just make, since you were born in Germany, let me reflect something strange about this country. We are such a diverse people. We're so fractious. We have these divided politics. But in some ways, we are one of the most nationalistic countries on earth. We do weep tears at, singing the Star-Spangled Banner at football games and all the rest. That there should be a nation and that it should be under God, seems to me is almost indisputable. But I don't know, Americans have a love for their country which sometimes approaches the absolute, and that's dangerous. If we ever stop fussing with each other, if we ever stop fussing with our government, and even fussing about such things as the Pledge of Allegiance and the national anthem, we will, by that measure, be less democratic, and we sure will be less Christian. And that's about all I have to say on that subject. It's a very, very, very good point, though.
And one more point was pursuit of happiness. Clearly an improvement over property. But my teacher and mentor, Paul Tillich, told us that you cannot pursue happiness. Happiness is a byproduct of the right life.
I think that's very close to what Jesus was saying. I do indeed. One more.
Where is God president for America?
Now, would you repeat that question?
In your opinion, I'm not asking who, in your opinion, where is God president for America?
Where is God present in America?
President for
Are you asking me whom I want to vote for in November?
No, I mean, it could be answered any way you want. That's the question. Do I do like they do the Miss American contest?
Did you say who or where?
Who's God's president?
Where? You said president.
Where is God's where?
Or God's presence. Which? Okay. I guess I have to just make a negative answer to that. If we ever think that we know that one person rather than another is God's choice, we have perhaps loosened our hold on theology and loosened our democracy. I will return back again to the saying that we are all capable of good and evil. There are no divine leaders. I mean, look, Adolf Hitler thought of himself as divine. I mean, it was demonic, but he still thought of himself as, somehow chosen by history, chosen by God. He could even use God language, couldn't he? Couldn't Hitler sometimes talk about God? At any rate, that's dangerous. Government is not God, neither is any president. I wish you a full supply of the Hebrew Bible, the teachings of Jesus, the advice of the church, and even the Holy Spirit as you go into the voting booth in November, but I will not tell you how the Holy Spirit is leading you to vote.
Don, thank you very much for this extraordinarily thoughtful statement. We're fortunate to have Ron Fields again this fall, recording the statements that are being made. And so what Dr. Shriver has said will be available in the church library. And if anybody wants to purchase a videotape, Ron says it can be produced easily. Beyond that, it seems to me that once in a while it's a good thing in this church to have a written record of things that we hear. And if anybody would like to volunteer to reduce this to writing, I think that there are people in the church who are already frustrated because there are 6 adult education programs on Sunday morning who would like to see it. But thank you, and Don, thank you very much for starting us again. We are adjourned.